Let me tell you something most people don't want to admit. Loneliness doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself. It slips in quietly, polite, almost gentle, like a guest who overstays their welcome without ever being invited. At first, it's subtle, a missed call here, a delayed reply there, you barely notice it, you tell yourself it's nothing. Until one day, it sits you down at a table meant for 17 people and reminds you that you're the only one left breathing in the room. That Thanksgiving morning, I stood barefoot in my kitchen, holding a wooden spoon over a pot of gravy that didn't need stirring anymore. The smell of sage and roasted turkey filled the air, warm, familiar, comforting in a way that somehow made the silence worse. The house wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, that makes you aware of every small sound, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of old floorboards settling. It felt like the house was watching me, waiting. The turkey sat in the center of the counter, golden brown and perfect, too perfect, like it had been prepared for an audience that never showed up. In the dining room, the table was fully set. 17 place settings, 17 plates, 17 forks and knives lined up neatly, 17 folded napkins, each placed just so. It looked like a cruel joke the universe forgot to explain. 17. I let out a small laugh under my breath, the kind people make when they're trying not to cry, and shook my head. Florence, I whispered to myself, get a grip. Because even then, even standing alone in that quiet house, part of me still believed they were coming. That's the dangerous thing about hope. It doesn't die easily. It drags itself forward long after it should have been laid to rest, long after it's done more harm than good. It convinces you to keep the lights on, to keep the food warm. To keep waiting, I checked the clock again. 2:17 p.m. They said they'd be there by 2. I told myself all the things I'd been telling myself for years. Traffic happens, kids get restless, plans run late, life is busy. I had spent 10 years making excuses for people who didn't show up. 10 years of convincing myself that absence didn't mean indifference. I walked through the dining room, straightening napkins no one would touch, adjusting chairs no one would sit in. I'd bought a new tablecloth just for this day, cream-colored with a subtle woven pattern, something elegant, something intentional, something that said this matters, because deep down I needed this to matter. This wasn't just another holiday. This was my last attempt to feel like I still belonged, and I didn't even know it yet. I moved slowly through the house, the same house where I'd raised my children. Every wall carried echoes, birthday parties, slammed doors, late-night laughter. Arguments followed by apologies whispered in hallways. Every corner held a memory, and every memory felt heavier without Richard. My husband had been gone for 10 years by then, 10 long, quiet, aching years. People like to say grief fades with time, that it softens, that it heals. What really happens is you just get better at carrying it without dropping everything. Richard loved Thanksgiving. He used to say it was his favorite holiday. No pressure, no gifts, no expectations. Just food, family, and togetherness. He carved the turkey like it was a sacred ritual, carefully passing plates like he was handing out blessings. Everyone eats, he'd say with a grin. No one leaves hungry. I swallowed hard and reached for my phone. No missed calls, no texts, no running late, no apologies, nothing. That's when the thought finally surfaced, the one I'd spent a decade pushing down. What if they're not coming? I sat at the head of the table. Richard's chair was still across from me. I'd never moved it. I suppose part of me believed that as long as it stayed there, so did he. The clock ticked louder than it ever had. 2:45, 3:10, 3:42. I reheated the food once, then again. By 5 o'clock, the turkey had dried out. By 6, so had my hope. And by 8 that night, I was sitting alone in a room built for noise, staring at 17 empty chairs, finally forced to face the truth I had avoided for 10 years. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't bad timing. This was a pattern, and patterns don't lie. That night, something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically. There was no breakdown, no tears on the floor. It was quieter than that, colder. Like a door closing somewhere deep inside my chest. And once it closed, there was no opening it again. But to understand why that table finally broke me, you need to know what my life looked like before everything fell apart. Before I was the woman eating Thanksgiving dinner alone at a table meant for 17, I was the woman who built a family people admired. Not because we were perfect, we weren't, but because we were present. 38 years earlier, I married Richard. He wasn't the kind of man who needed attention. He didn't fill a room with noise. He filled it with steadiness, with reliability. With a sense that no matter how chaotic the world became, there was one place where things would always make sense. He was my safe place long before I even knew I needed one. We met young. Not recklessly young, but young enough to grow together instead of apart. We didn't have dramatic love stories or grand gestures. Our love was quieter than that, built in moments most people overlook, morning routines. Shared glances across crowded rooms, hands finding each other without looking. We married without much money and without much fear. Looking back, I think that was the secret. We trusted the future because we trusted each other. We built a home in a quiet Connecticut neighborhood, the kind of place where children rode bikes until the streetlights came on and neighbors waved because they actually knew your name. The kind of place where people borrowed sugar and returned it with baked goods. Richard worked in commercial real estate development. Long hours, serious meetings, endless plans for buildings that would stand long after we were gone. I was a school librarian for 30 years. I loved that job, the smell of books, the hush of reading rooms, the joy of watching a child discover a story that made their eyes light up. We didn't chase luxury, we chased stability. And we were good at it. Every morning before I even opened my eyes, Richard kissed my forehead. Every single morning. Not because it was romantic, but because it was us. And every night we sat on the back porch, sweet tea in the summer. Hot cocoa in the winter. Sometimes we talked about the kids, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing at all. That was our magic, the quiet stuff. Our house was never empty. If someone needed a place to go, they came to us. Birthdays spilled into the driveway. Sunday barbecues lasted until dark. Holidays were loud, crowded, chaotic, and full. Richard used to joke that our house had a revolving door, and then there were our children. Lauren, Michael, and Jennifer. Lauren was strong-willed from the moment she learned to speak, ambitious, determined. She always knew exactly what she wanted, and she wasn't afraid to go after it. Michael was quieter, thoughtful. The kind of child who noticed details others missed. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it mattered. Jennifer was our youngest, the one who always needed us most, or at least that's what I believed at the time. She was sensitive, emotional, and deeply attached to home, or so I thought. We poured everything into them. We paid for college without complaint, helped with down payments when they were starting out, babysat without being asked. Rearranged our lives so theirs could be easier. We celebrated every milestone like it was a national holiday. We didn't miss things, we showed up. Our dining table was custom made to seat 12 because family mattered to us. Because togetherness wasn't optional in our house. There was always room for one more plate, one more chair, one more story. I truly believed something then. I believed that love was a circle. That what you pour into your children comes back to you. That devotion creates devotion. I didn't know that love could become a dead end. Then came March 14th. Richard had been tired, more than usual. He complained of chest discomfort, not sharp pain, just pressure. The kind of symptoms men brush off because admitting weakness feels worse than the pain itself. I begged him to see a doctor. He promised he would. He always promised. That morning he collapsed in our bedroom while getting dressed for work. One moment he was reaching for his tie. The next, he was on the floor. The paramedics worked on him for 40 minutes of chest compressions. Defibrillator shocks, medical jargon shouted across the room, and prayers whispered under my breath that went unanswered. I stood there watching the man I had built my life with slip away, and just like that, everything ended. The funeral was packed. Over 300 people filled the room. Colleagues, friends, neighbors, everyone had something kind to say. What a good man, what a devoted husband. You were so lucky, and they were right. But when the chairs emptied and the flowers wilted, so did my support. When the crowds went home, so did my children. At first, they were attentive. Calls every day, help with groceries, sorting through Richard's things. I told myself this is what family does, but grief has a way of revealing truth, and truth doesn't care how much it hurts, because slowly, so slowly I almost missed it, they stopped coming. And that's when the silence began to get louder. Nobody prepares you for how abandonment actually happens. We imagine it as something dramatic, a fight, harsh words, slammed doors, or a moment so painful you'd remember it forever. We expect clarity, a reason, an ending we can point to and say, that's when it broke. But real abandonment doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly. It comes as less phone calls, less effort, less presence. Until one day you realize you're the only one still reaching. In the months after Richard's death, the calls came daily. Morning check-ins, evening updates, questions about whether I'd eaten, whether I'd slept. They worried. Or at least it looked like they did. Then daily turned into every few days turned into once a week turned into, sorry mom, it's been hectic. I told myself I understood. I told myself I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be that parent, the lonely one, the needy one, the one everyone secretly avoids. So I gave them space, and they took everything else with it. That first Thanksgiving without Richard, I assumed I'd be with one of them. That's how it had always been. There was never a question about it. 2 weeks before the holiday, Lauren called. Mom, we're doing something small this year. Just Brad's family. Her voice was apologetic but firm, already decided. Michael was spending Thanksgiving with his in-laws. Jennifer had plans in Boston. Everyone had somewhere to be except me. I spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time in my life. I cooked for myself, I ate quietly, I washed the dishes in silence. I told myself it was temporary. Next year will be different. Christmas proved me wrong. I offered to host. I offered to cook, I offered to travel. There was always a reason, always an excuse, always a promise to make it up later. Christmas morning, I sat alone in my living room surrounded by wrapped gifts no one came to collect. That was the moment something shifted. Not shattered, shifted. I realized I was no longer essential. I was becoming optional. By the second year, I was trying harder than ever. More calls, more invitations, more flexibility. I adjusted my schedule, lowered my expectations, told myself love meant understanding. By the third year, I was being left out entirely. Birthday parties I learned about through Facebook photos. Graduations announced in posts that tagged everyone except me. Vacations documented in smiling pictures where I was noticeably absent. I smiled at those photos. I cried after. Once I drove 2 hours with a homemade cake for Michael's birthday, his favorite, the one I'd been making since he was 5 years old, chocolate with peanut butter frosting. I remembered because mothers always remember. He didn't invite me in. He stood in the doorway, uncomfortable, distracted, glancing behind him like he hoped someone would rescue him from the conversation. I didn't know you were coming, he said. I left the cake on the porch. I cried the entire drive home, and still, I kept trying, because mothers are wired to hope even when hope humiliates us, even when it makes us feel small, even when it teaches us lessons we never asked to learn. By year 10, I wasn't asking anymore. I was begging. I waited for calls that never came. I sent messages I pretended didn't hurt when they went unanswered. I measured my worth in how quickly someone replied or if they replied at all. And then came that Thanksgiving, the one with 17 empty chairs. That was the moment I finally understood something painful and freeing. You can love people with everything you have and still mean nothing to them. Love doesn't guarantee loyalty, sacrifice doesn't ensure gratitude, and being a good parent doesn't promise you won't be left behind. Once you see that clearly, something inside you changes. You stop chasing people who don't choose you. You stop begging for a place at tables where your seat has already been given away. And when that realization arrives, when it finally settles in your bones, you're faced with a choice. Keep breaking yourself trying to belong, or walk away and learn how to belong to yourself. And that choice changes everything. Let me tell you the strangest part about being forgotten. You don't disappear all at once. You don't wake up one morning erased. You fade quietly, politely, gradually. So slowly, in fact, that by the time you realize what's happening, you've already been written out of a story you helped build, a life you helped hold together, a family you once centered. By the fourth year after Richard died, my world had shrunk down to silence and routines, predictable days stacked on top of each other like identical boxes. Wake up, make coffee for one, read the paper. Sit in a house that suddenly felt far too large for a single heartbeat. The rooms echoed now, not with sound but with absence. Chairs went unused, hallways stayed quiet, doors rarely opened. Still, I kept my phone close. Always charged, always nearby, always face up on the table, because hope is stubborn like that. Every ring still made my heart jump. Every vibration sent a small rush through my chest. Every unknown number carried the possibility of meaning. Maybe today, most days, there was nothing. On the rare occasions when my children did call, I learned how to stretch conversations. I asked questions instead of answering them. I listened closely. I laughed when appropriate. I pretended not to notice how distracted they sounded, how conversations felt like obligations squeezed between more important things. I became an expert at not asking for too much, because asking felt dangerous. Asking risked making them uncomfortable. Asking might push them further away. Asking might confirm what I was trying desperately not to believe. So I stopped saying things like, I miss you, I'm lonely, I need you. Instead, I said the safest sentence I knew. I'm fine, over and over again. There's something strange about that word, fine. It tells people exactly what they want to hear. It frees them from responsibility. It gives them permission to move on without guilt. And when you say it long enough, people stop questioning it. Or maybe, and this is harder to accept, they never wanted to question it in the first place. By the fifth year, the shift became undeniable. I wasn't being forgotten. I was being excluded. That distinction matters. Forgetting implies accident. Exclusion requires choice. Plans were being made without me. Holidays decided without discussion. Gatherings arranged where my absence was not an oversight but a given. I'd see the evidence online, photos posted casually, whole family gatherings, all my children, all my grandchildren. Even Richard's sister, everyone smiling, everyone together without me. I remember one photo in particular, a birthday party for one of my grandchildren, bright balloons, decorations taped to walls. A cake sitting proudly in the center of the table, a cake I would have made myself if I'd been asked. I stared at that photo longer than I should have, zoomed in slowly. studied faces the way detectives do, searching for guilt, hesitation, discomfort. Anything that said they noticed I wasn't there, there was nothing, no awkward smiles, no forced expressions, no sign of absence. That's when the realization landed heavy and final. They didn't miss me because my absence didn't disrupt their lives. I had become optional, background noise. And background noise is easy to mute. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I wasn't being pushed away, I was being lived without. And the most painful part, life was going on just fine without me in it. People like to believe abandonment only hurts emotionally. That it lives somewhere in the chest, a dull ache, a quiet sadness you learn to ignore. They're wrong. Abandonment shows up most clearly when you're afraid and there's no one left to call. When something goes wrong and your first instinct is to reach for a phone, and then you remember there's no one on the other end who will actually come. The first time I truly understood that was in the 4th year after Richard died. It was winter. One of those deceptively calm mornings when the driveway looks harmless until your feet hit ice. I stepped outside to get the mail, thinking about nothing at all, and suddenly the ground was gone beneath me. I fell hard. The pain was immediate, sharp, electric, shooting up my arm like lightning. My wrist bent in a way it never should have. I sat there in the cold, stunned, staring at my hand and knowing something was terribly wrong. Eventually, I managed to get myself to the emergency room. Alone. I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, clutching my arm, watching families come and go. People holding hands, people arguing gently. People comforting one another. I called Lauren, she answered, sounded rushed. Mom, is everything okay? I told her what happened. She said she'd try to stop by. She didn't. Hours passed. X-rays, questions, paperwork. The doctor confirmed it, a clean break. They wrapped my wrist in a cast and sent me home with instructions I struggled to hear over the realization settling in my chest. I was on my own. I learned how to button shirts with one hand, how to cook meals without dropping pans, how to carry groceries by balancing bags against my forearm, how to sleep sitting upright because lying down sent pain through my arm. No one came, not once, not to check in, not to help. Not to sit beside me for 5 minutes. That was when I stopped expecting rescue. By the 6th year, I thought I'd already learned the hardest lessons life had to offer. I was wrong. I found a lump in my breast during a routine shower. Small, firm, unmistakable. Fear has a physical sensation. It tightens your stomach, makes your hands shake, pulls the air out of your lungs. In that moment, every worst-case scenario rushed in at once. The mammogram, the biopsy, the waiting. I sat alone in that doctor's office, staring at a wall I couldn't focus on, wondering if this was how my life would end, quietly, inconveniently, without disrupting anyone's schedule. I didn't call my children. Not because I didn't need them, but because I already knew the outcome. Waiting rooms teach you a lot about people. Mostly, they teach you who matters to whom. I watched others get comforting texts, calls asking for updates. Loved ones pacing the hallways. I had none of that. When the test results came back benign, I sat in my car and cried, not from relief, from grief, because a realization hit me harder than the fear ever had. If it had been cancer, no one would have known, not until it was too late, and even then I wasn't sure anyone would have come. I never told my children about it. What would have been the point? By then, I had learned a painful truth. Sharing vulnerability with people who don't show up doesn't make them care more. It only teaches them how little effort is required to keep you at a distance. So I stopped sharing. I stopped calling when I was scared, stopped mentioning doctor appointments, stopped admitting when days felt heavy, and that's how people confuse strength with absence. They see survival and call it independence. They see silence and assume contentment. They mistake endurance for resilience, but there's nothing strong about having no one to lean on. There's only necessity, and necessity is a lonely teacher. For 10 years, I lied to myself, not once. Not occasionally, every single day. I told myself they were busy. I told myself grief looks different for everyone. I told myself time would soften the distance, that eventually things would return to what they once were. Time doesn't heal neglect, it normalizes it. It turns absence into routine, silence into expectation, disappointment into something you learn to swallow without choking. By the 8th year, the calls had been reduced to the bare minimum. Birthdays, Mother's Day, holidays that came with obligation attached. The conversations were short, awkward, careful. You can hear obligation in someone's voice. It sounds rushed, distracted, like they're checking a box rather than connecting. Happy birthday, Mom. Love you. Click, and that was it. I started talking to Richard's photograph. At first, it felt strange, embarrassing even, but grief doesn't ask permission, it just looks for somewhere to land. I told him about my days, about the quiet, about the things I never said out loud anymore. Sometimes I asked him what I should do. Sometimes I just sat there, pretending he was listening. I'd stand in his closet longer than necessary, breathing in the faint trace of his cologne, letting myself believe, if only for a moment, that he was just in the next room. That house was swallowing me whole, room by room. memory by memory, and no one noticed. By the 10th year, logic had finally caught up with reality. I knew better than to hope, but hope doesn't always listen to logic. That Thanksgiving, I did something I had never done before. I begged. Not hinted, not suggested, not casually mentioned, begged. I called each of my children. I told them I was lonely. I told them I was struggling. I told them I couldn't survive another holiday alone. I stripped myself of dignity because I thought honesty might finally reach them. They said maybe. They said we'll see. They said that sounds nice. I heard yes because I needed to. I spent 3 days cooking, 3 full days. I set the table for 17, bought fresh flowers, new napkins, polished silverware that hadn't been touched in years. I wanted everything perfect. I wanted to remind them of who we used to be, of the family we once were. And when they didn't show, something inside me didn't shatter. It ended. There was no dramatic collapse, no loud breaking point, just a clean, quiet finality like a switch being flipped off. Endings do that, they clarify things fast. Because that night, sitting alone at a table built for togetherness, I finally accepted the truth I had been avoiding for a decade. I wasn't waiting for my children anymore. I was waiting for permission to leave, permission to stop hoping, permission to stop chasing, permission to stop proving my worth to people who no longer saw it. And the moment I understood that, something shifted, not outwardly, internally. I realized I didn't need their approval to reclaim my life. I needed courage, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't holding on. It's walking away from the lie that tells you love will eventually come back if you wait long enough. Here's the thing about being underestimated. People stop watching you, they stop asking questions, they stop paying attention, they stop imagining that you might still be capable of surprise. And that's exactly when you become the most dangerous version of yourself. My children thought they understood me. In their minds, I was a grieving widow sitting alone in a house too big for one person, a woman stuck in memories. A mother clinging to a past that no longer existed, someone fragile, someone dependent, someone who needed them far more than they needed her. They assumed my life had stalled the moment Richard died. What they never saw, what they never bothered to ask, was how I was actually surviving. They never questioned how the bills were always paid on time, never wondered why I never stressed about money, never noticed that I quietly helped them when they struggled without hesitation, without conditions, because people rarely question what benefits them. Richard and I made a decision early in our marriage, long before success found us. We agreed we would live comfortably, not loudly. No flashy cars sitting in driveways, no extravagant vacations posted for others to admire, no expensive habits that announced wealth. We wanted our children to learn independence, to build lives without leaning on us, to understand effort before entitlement, so we kept things quiet, very quiet. Richard's commercial real estate business grew steadily over the years, not explosively, not recklessly. Just consistently, properties in the right places, investments that matured over decades instead of months, deals built on patience rather than spectacle, the kind of wealth that doesn't shout, the kind that compounds while no one is looking. There were properties my children never knew existed, accounts they'd never heard mentioned, holdings that weren't discussed at the dinner table, and when Richard died, everything transferred to me, not shared, not split, not distributed, me. I remember the first time I sat alone with the paperwork spread across the dining table, documents that represented decades of work, numbers that could intimidate anyone unfamiliar with them. I didn't panic. I didn't crumble. I learned how to read balance sheets, how to oversee property managers, how to ask the right questions, how to listen closely when advisors spoke, and how to push back when something didn't feel right. I didn't rush. I didn't splurge. I didn't try to fill the silence with spending. I handled it quietly. While my children slowly drifted away emotionally, I remained steady financially. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. They saw an aging mother growing smaller. What they missed was a woman growing sharper, more observant, more deliberate, more aware of where she stood and where she was taken for granted. I noticed how rarely they asked about my life, how conversations stayed surface level, how they talked at me instead of with me. I noticed how quickly they assumed I'd always be there, always available, always forgiving, always willing to step in if things went wrong. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook generosity for obligation. They mistook my restraint for incapacity, and I let them, because sometimes the smartest move isn't correcting people's assumptions, it's letting them believe them. Because when people stop paying attention to you, they also stop preparing for you, and that's when control quietly returns to the hands of the one they underestimated. This is the part that still stings the most when I think about it. I was helping them even as they were forgetting me, quietly, consistently, without recognition, and not because I wanted praise, but because love, for a long time, still guided my choices even when it no longer guided theirs. Michael was the first. His daughter had been accepted into a private school with an excellent academic reputation, the kind of place parents dream about and quietly panic over once the tuition numbers arrive. He never told me he was struggling to afford it. He didn't have to. I could hear the stress in his voice during our occasional phone calls, the way he changed subjects too quickly. The way money came up indirectly, as jokes, as sighs, as offhand comments, so I made a call. Through one of Richard's old charitable vehicles, I set up an anonymous scholarship fund, perfectly legitimate, perfectly untraceable. Every year, half of that tuition was covered. Michael thanked the school administrator, thanked the universe, thanked his luck. He never thanked me. Jennifer came next. Her husband had ambitions, big ones. He wanted to expand his business, take risks, grow faster than his current resources allowed. Banks were hesitant, investors stalled, cash flow became tight. Again, no one asked me for help, but I noticed. I noticed the sudden tension in Jennifer's voice, the way she spoke faster, the way conversations ended abruptly, the way stress slipped into every sentence. I stepped in as a silent investor. The money moved through a holding company. The paperwork was clean, the terms were generous, the relief was immediate, the business expanded, stability returned, they celebrated, they never wondered how it happened. Then there was Lauren, strong, independent, proud. When she lost her job during a corporate restructuring, she didn't call me in panic. She didn't ask for help. But stress doesn't hide well from a mother. 3 months without income was enough to turn security into fear. Mortgage payments became a looming weight. Sleep became difficult. I arranged for 3 months of her mortgage to be covered, rooted through a check she believed came from one of Richard's old business connections. She cried on the phone. From relief, she thanked someone else, and I listened quietly on the other end. None of them knew, and none of them asked. They accepted the help, they accepted the relief, they accepted the benefits, and still they didn't call. That was when something uncomfortable settled into place. They didn't see me as a person anymore. I wasn't a mother they worried about. I wasn't a woman with a life, fears, or needs. I was a background presence, a resource. A safety net that didn't require maintenance. People don't check the foundation of a house when everything feels stable. They don't inspect what's holding things up when nothing appears to be falling apart. They assume it will always be there. Unmoving, uncomplaining, unnoticed. And I allowed that assumption to stand, not because I was weak, but because I was learning how invisible I had become, learning how much they took for granted, learning exactly what would happen if the foundation ever stepped away. That Thanksgiving night, the one with 17 empty chairs, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I didn't scream. I didn't rage. I didn't collapse under the weight of it all. I sat there alone at the head of the table in a calm that surprised even me, because something had finally settled. Clarity. Not the kind that crashes into you all at once, but the kind that arrives quietly, like a truth that's been waiting patiently for you to stop lying to yourself. I wasn't unwanted, I was unnecessary, and that realization cut deeper than rejection ever could. Unwanted hurts, unnecessary liberates, unwanted makes you beg to be chosen, unnecessary reminds you that you are free to choose yourself. The following Monday morning, I woke up early, not from anxiety, but from resolve. I dressed carefully, the way I used to when I had important meetings to attend. I put on a coat, gathered my purse, and locked the door behind me with intention. Then I drove to my lawyer's office. Gerald had known Richard for over 30 years. They'd built trust through decades of work, late nights, and long conversations about business and life. When he looked up and saw me walk in, he smiled, the kind of smile reserved for someone you respect. "Florence," he said warmly, "what can I do for you?" I sat down across from him, folded my hands, and spoke clearly without hesitation. "Gerald, I need to make some changes." He leaned back slightly, studying my expression. "Big changes?" he asked. "The biggest," I replied, and in that moment something shifted inside me. For the first time in over a decade, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't responding to neglect. I wasn't adjusting to disappointment. I wasn't bracing myself for silence. I was deciding. Decisions like that don't come from anger. They come from acceptance, from finally understanding where you stand and refusing to stand there any longer. I told Gerald everything, about the years of absence, about the emotional distance, about the quiet financial support, about the Thanksgiving table that finally forced me to see reality without illusion. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You've been generous," he said, "more generous than most." "I know," I replied. "That's why this has to change." What I asked for wasn't revenge, it was alignment. I wanted my life and my resources to reflect truth, not obligation. I wanted my choices to match my reality instead of the fantasy I'd been clinging to. We began reviewing documents, trust structures, estate plans, beneficiaries, long-standing assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years. Each page I signed felt lighter than the last. Not because I was taking something away, but because I was taking myself back. I wasn't erasing my children from my life. I was removing their entitlement to a version of me that no longer existed. I walked out of that office different than when I walked in, straighter, quieter, unburdened. For the first time since Richard died, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control, not control over others, but over myself. And once you reclaim that, everything else becomes optional. There comes a moment in every person's life when they stop asking to be understood, not because they no longer care, but because they finally understand themselves. That's the moment everything changes. That's the moment you stop shrinking your truth to fit other people's comfort. The moment you realize that explaining yourself to people who have already decided who you are is a waste of breath. When I told Gerald I wanted to make changes, he didn't interrupt me. He didn't soften his voice or rush to reassure me. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and studied me the way people do when they sense something irreversible is happening. "What kind of changes, Florence?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "I'm done maintaining a life that only benefits people who don't show up for me." The words didn't shake as they left my mouth. They didn't need to. I'd rehearsed them silently for years. The room went quiet, not awkward quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, intentional quiet, the kind that lets a decision settle into the space where excuses used to live. Gerald nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "let's talk logistics." And just like that, the emotional part ended. From that moment on, everything became business. That surprised me, how calm I felt once the decision was made. I'd spent 10 years bracing for emotional collapse, for regret, for guilt strong enough to pull me back into old patterns. None of that came. Clarity has a way of neutralizing chaos. Over the next 3 months, I dismantled the life my children assumed would always be waiting for them. Not dramatically, not loudly, not angrily, piece by piece, quietly, legally, no announcements, no confrontations. No explanations, because people who ignored your silence don't deserve your speeches. The first thing to go was the family home. That house had been the center of my identity for nearly 4 decades. It held scraped knees and late-night talks, slamming doors followed by apologies whispered through tears, laughter that spilled into hallways, arguments that ended at the dinner table. It was where Richard kissed my forehead every morning, where he carved turkeys with the same reverence every Thanksgiving, where we believed family would always return. But for the last 10 years, it hadn't been a home, it had been a museum, a shrine to people who no longer visited. Every empty room reminded me of absence. Every untouched chair reinforced the truth I kept avoiding, that I was preserving space for people who had already moved on, so I listed it. Signing the paperwork felt strange, not painful, just final, as if I were closing a chapter that had been over long before I acknowledged it. 2 weeks later, a young couple walked through the front door with their realtor, nervous smiles, gentle hands resting on a growing belly. Their first baby was on the way. They walked room to room with wonder, imagining birthdays, holidays, futures. Hope filled the space where grief had been sitting for years. They made an offer the same day, $2.3 million. As I sat at the closing table weeks later, pen in hand, I waited for the tears everyone warns you about. They didn't come. What I felt instead was relief. Pure, unfiltered relief. Not because I was erasing my past, but because I was releasing myself from living inside it. That was the day I stopped explaining myself. And once you stop explaining, you start moving forward without asking permission. Selling the house was symbolic, necessary but symbolic. The real work happened quietly, behind closed doors, in places my children never thought to look, places where assumptions live comfortably because no one expects them to change. I didn't announce anything, I didn't warn anyone. I simply began. Accounts that had been open for decades were reviewed, then closed. Joint holdings were separated. Investment structures that once existed out of convenience were reorganized with intention. Everything moved into my name. Clean, precise, final. It wasn't about secrecy, it was about accuracy. For years, my life had been operating on outdated expectations, theirs, not mine. Financial paths designed for a future that no longer existed. Contingencies built for people who had already checked out emotionally. I corrected that. Property by property, I liquidated what no longer served me. Some assets were sold, others were consolidated. Long-standing arrangements were untangled with the help of professionals who understood discretion. No chaos, no drama, no mess, just alignment. And then came the hardest decision of all. I stopped helping them, not abruptly, not theatrically, not with bitterness. I simply withdrew. The anonymous scholarship fund covering half of Michael's daughter's private school tuition closed. The silent investment stabilizing Jennifer's husband's business, withdrawn at the next allowable window. The quiet financial cushion that had softened Lauren's rough patches for years, gone, not out of punishment, out of truth. Support without presence isn't generosity, it's self erasure, and I had erased myself long enough. I didn't do this to hurt them, I did it to stop hurting myself. There's a difference, one they might never understand, but one I finally respected. They felt it almost immediately. Expenses became heavier, margins tightened, opportunities stalled without explanation. They didn't know where the shift came from, only that things felt harder than they used to. Still, there were no calls. No concern, no curiosity, no sudden desire to reconnect, which told me everything I needed to know. The relationship had never been emotional, it had been functional. As long as life ran smoothly, my presence wasn't required. As long as support existed without effort, no maintenance was necessary. I wasn't missed, I was used. And that realization, painful as it was, brought an unexpected sense of peace because it removed the last illusion. Love doesn't disappear quietly, it withers loudly when it's deprived of convenience. And when nothing came back once the support was gone, not a call, not a visit, not even a question, the truth became undeniable. They hadn't been choosing me, they had been benefiting from me, so I finished what I started. Every remaining financial thread tying my life to theirs was reviewed. Some were severed, others were rewritten, none were left unattended. I wasn't burning bridges, I was reclaiming boundaries, and boundaries don't require announcements. They speak for themselves. Once everything was in motion, once the paperwork was signed, the account settled, and the future redirected, I made 3 phone calls. Not emotional, not confrontational, not angry, final. I didn't rehearse them. I didn't brace myself for disappointment. I spoke the way people do when they've already accepted the outcome. I called Lauren first. She answered on the second ring, surprised. "Mom, I'm selling the house," I said calmly. "I'm moving, I don't know where yet. If there's anything you want, photos, keepsakes, anything from your room, you have 2 weeks to come get it." There was a pause. Not concern, not curiosity, just processing. "Okay, Mom," she said finally. "Good luck." That was it. No questions about where I was going, no offer to help, no ask of whether I was okay, just an ending disguised as politeness. Michael didn't even return my call. I left a voicemail. Simple, direct, informational. He never responded. Jennifer sent a message instead, a crying emoji. 2 words, "Miss you." Not "where are you going," not "are you safe." Not "can I come see you," just a feeling detached from action. And that was all the confirmation I needed. Not one of them asked where I was going. Not one of them asked if I needed help. Not one of them asked if I was all right. So I packed the house myself, room by room, drawer by drawer, decade by decade. 38 years of life reduced to boxes stacked neatly in the hallway. I donated most of it. Furniture that had hosted holidays no one came to anymore. China that had waited years to be used again. Decorations wrapped carefully by habit, not necessity. Memories only matter when they're shared, and mine no longer were. I kept what fit in my car, some clothes, a few photo albums, Richard's wedding ring, one quilt my mother made by hand. Everything else I let go, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Because holding on to things tied to people who no longer hold on to you is just another way of delaying freedom. On the final morning, the house was empty. No echo, no weight, no ghosts. I walked through each room one last time, not to say goodbye, but to acknowledge that this chapter had ended long ago. At the front door, I paused, then I locked it, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel loss. I felt movement. I didn't look back because some doors don't need closure, they need distance. There's something deeply powerful about leaving quietly. No goodbye tour, no dramatic exit, no emotional speeches that get dissected, questioned, or rewritten by people who never listened in the first place. Quiet leaving doesn't seek approval. It doesn't explain itself. It simply goes. By March, almost exactly 11 years after Richard died, my life in Connecticut no longer existed, not in any meaningful way. The house was sold, the accounts were closed, the legal ties were severed. Everything that had once anchored me to that place was gone. I changed my phone number. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't update anyone on my plans. I didn't announce where I was going. I opened new bank accounts in a new state, built new systems, new routines, a new life that didn't require justification. To the outside world, it probably looked sudden. To me, it felt overdue. The truth is, I had already left emotionally years before my body followed. The morning I drove away, I loaded my car before sunrise. The sky was still dark, the air sharp and biting. That kind of cold that settles into your joints and reminds you how awake you are. I stood in the driveway for a moment, keys in my hand, looking at a house that no longer belonged to me, emotionally or legally. It didn't feel nostalgic, it didn't feel tragic, it felt complete. I wasn't grieving the house. I had already mourned it, one empty holiday at a time. Some people think disappearing means running away. They're wrong. Running away is fueled by fear. What I did was fueled by clarity. Sometimes disappearing is the bravest thing you can do, especially when staying means continuing to erase yourself for the comfort of others. I got into my car and pulled out quietly just as I had lived for years. No one waved, no one noticed, and that was the point. I drove south with the radio off, letting the silence stretch as far as it wanted to. No schedule. No deadlines, no obligation to check in with anyone. For the first time in over a decade, I wasn't reachable. And the strangest thing happened. Nothing bad occurred. The world didn't collapse. No emergency followed. No frantic call came through. Life simply continued without me managing it for everyone else. That silence everyone fears, it wasn't empty, it was spacious. It allowed thoughts to finish, feelings to settle, breath to deepen. I wasn't filling gaps anymore. I wasn't compensating for absence. I was just existing, and that felt revolutionary. I realized something on that drive, something that would have terrified me years earlier. I didn't miss anyone. Not because I lacked love, but because love had been a one-way street for so long that my heart had already adapted. I wasn't numb. I was free, free from waiting, free from disappointment, free from the exhausting work of being overlooked. Leaving quietly isn't about punishing others. It's about choosing yourself without demanding permission. And once you do that, the noise you used to live in suddenly feels unnecessary. By the time the sun rose fully, Connecticut was miles behind me, so was the version of myself that thought staying meant loyalty. Sometimes loyalty to others is betrayal of yourself, and I was done with betrayal. I chose Charleston for reasons that had nothing to do with running away, and everything to do with remembering who I was before life narrowed. Richard and I had honeymooned there decades earlier, back when the future still felt wide open and forgiving. Charleston was warm in a way that went beyond weather. The streets moved slower. The air carried salt and history. People looked at one another when they spoke. It was one of the few places untouched by disappointment. The memories I had there didn't ache. They didn't remind me of loss. They reminded me of beginnings. So when it came time to choose where I would land, not temporarily, not cautiously, but deliberately, Charleston felt right in a way I didn't need to justify. I bought a small condo overlooking the harbor, not flashy, not massive, not designed to impress anyone, perfect. It had light, quiet, a balcony just large enough for a chair, a table, and mornings that belonged only to me. No empty rooms echoing with what used to be, no space demanding to be filled. The first morning I woke up there, I made coffee and stepped onto the balcony just as the sun began to rise. The water reflected gold and pink, and boats moved slowly like they weren't in a hurry to become anything else. I didn't check my phone. I didn't feel that familiar pull, the one that whispers maybe today they'll call. Because for the first time in 11 years, I wasn't waiting. That realization hit me harder than grief ever had. Waiting had been my identity for so long that I hadn't realized how much energy it consumed, waiting to be remembered. Waiting to be included, waiting to matter again. Without that wait, my days opened up. I joined a local book club, nothing formal, just a group of people who loved stories and conversation. No one asked invasive questions. No one rushed me. We talked about characters, ideas, and the quiet joys of being understood without explanation. I volunteered at an animal shelter twice a week. Dogs don't care about your past. They don't measure your worth by availability. They just show up tail wagging, present, grateful. It felt like learning trust again. I signed up for an art class on a whim. I had no expectations, no talent as far as I knew. But something about standing in front of a blank canvas felt familiar. Turns out I loved painting, not because I was good at it, but because it didn't require permission. I could make mistakes, start over, change direction halfway through. No one judged. I made friends, real ones, people who invited me to dinner and meant it. Conversations that didn't feel rushed or transactional, invitations that didn't come with disclaimers or excuses. We lingered over meals. Shared stories, laughed without keeping score, and slowly, without effort, my life filled. Not with noise, with meaning. I traveled, Italy first, walking streets Richard and I had only ever talked about, sitting in cafes without checking the time, letting joy arrive without guilt attached. Then Ireland, green hills, cold air, music spilling out of pubs like memory itself had learned to sing. I carried Richard with me, not as a wound, but as a companion. Someone who would have loved knowing I finally went. And here's what surprised me most of all. I didn't feel guilty. Not for being happy, not for spending money, not for living fully. I had spent years believing that grief meant restraint. That love meant limitation, that happiness required justification. It doesn't. Grief doesn't ask you to stop living. It asks you to live differently, more honestly, more carefully, more aligned. I wasn't replacing what I'd lost. I was honoring it by refusing to let the rest of my life disappear in its shadow. Charleston didn't save me. I saved myself there. Charleston just gave me the space to remember how. I had been gone for almost a year when the past finally noticed. Not my absence, my independence. Life in Charleston had settled into something steady, not exciting in a dramatic way, but grounded. I had routines. People who expected me to show up, days that felt complete without explanation. Then one afternoon, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. Florence, Gerald said carefully when I answered, his voice already carrying weight. I thought you should know your daughter Lauren has been trying to reach me. I laughed, not bitterly, not cruelly, honestly. What does she want? I asked. There was a pause. She's asking questions, he said, about the house sale, about Richard's estate, about your assets. And there it was, the exact moment they realized I was gone, not because they missed me, but because something they assumed would always be accessible wasn't. Gerald explained what had happened. Lauren and her husband had driven by the old house, only to find strangers living there. Michael had tried accessing an account tied to one of Richard's former partnerships and discovered it had been closed. Jennifer had contacted one of Richard's old business associates, confused and frustrated, only to be told everything had been liquidated months ago. The safety net they'd never acknowledged had vanished, and suddenly silence wasn't comfortable anymore. Michael showed up unannounced at Gerald's office, demanding explanations, not asking how I was, not wondering where I'd gone, demanding. Lauren hired a private investigator, not to find me but to locate assets. Jennifer sent emails filled with concern and confusion, long messages asking what was happening, what had changed, why things felt different. After 11 years of distance, they were loud, urgent, persistent, and that told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't been worried when I stopped calling. They hadn't been alarmed when I sold the house. They hadn't panicked when months passed without contact, but the moment access disappeared, they noticed. That realization didn't hurt the way I expected. It clarified. I asked Gerald one question. Have they asked about me? He hesitated, then answered honestly. No, he said, not really. I thanked him for the update and ended the call. I didn't call my children. I didn't write letters. I didn't explain. Because explanations are for people who showed up when it mattered. That evening, I walked down to the harbor. The sun was low, the water calm, boats rocked gently like they weren't in a hurry to go anywhere. I sat on a bench and watched the light fade. I felt something unfamiliar, relief, because I finally understood that leaving quietly had worked. The noise came only when convenience disappeared. And that meant my silence had spoken clearly enough. Some people only hear you when you stop holding them up, and once you see that, you don't rush back to be heard. You keep walking forward, lighter, clearer, and finally free. It's remarkable how quickly people find time when money enters the conversation. Time they didn't have for years, energy they couldn't spare for holidays, concern they never expressed when silence was convenient. Once Gerald forwarded them my new email address, the messages didn't trickle in. They flooded, long messages, emotional messages, carefully worded messages designed to sound caring without admitting responsibility. Suddenly, everyone had feelings they'd never mentioned before. Mom, we've been so worried about you. Why would you disappear like this? This isn't like you. Please call me. I read every word slowly, not with anger, with clarity. Because it was impossible not to notice the timing. 10 years of quiet, 10 years of unanswered holidays, 10 years of absence, and now urgency. Lauren's messages came first, authoritative as always. Concern wrapped tightly around demand. She asked where I was, why I'd made such drastic decisions, and reminded me of how much family mattered, as if that had ever been in question. Michael followed, defensive, measured, rationalizing. Explaining how busy life had been, how stressful things were, how I couldn't expect people to always show up. Jennifer's messages were the most emotional. She talked about the grandchildren, about confusion, about hurt feelings, about how difficult this was for them. Not once did she ask how I'd survived 11 years of being forgotten. Not one message mentioned Thanksgiving, not the empty table, not the unanswered invitations. Not the nights I sat alone, convincing myself to hope again. They skipped over the pain like it was irrelevant, because acknowledging it would require accountability, and accountability was never the goal. These messages weren't about reconciliation. They were about control. They weren't worried I was lonely. They were worried I was unavailable, unavailable emotionally, unavailable financially, unavailable to step in when things went wrong. They weren't asking if I was okay. They were asking why access had disappeared. I didn't respond right away, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was calm. That surprised me most of all. There was a time when messages like these would have unraveled me, when I would have rushed to explain, to reassure, to soften the truth so no one else felt uncomfortable. That woman no longer existed. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel tempted to justify myself. I felt observant. I noticed what was being said and what wasn't. I noticed how concern arrived only after inconvenience, how questions centered on decisions instead of well-being, how urgency replaced indifference the moment assumptions were disrupted. People often reveal their priorities not by what they say, but by when they say it, and the timing told me everything. For the first time, I understood something with absolute certainty. They hadn't lost me, they'd lost access, and those are very different things. I closed my laptop and went for a walk along the harbor. The air was warm, the water steady. Boats moved with no urgency, arriving when they arrived, leaving when they were ready. No one demanded explanations from them. I smiled at the thought, because for the first time I wasn't reacting to the noise. I was choosing when and if I would speak, and that kind of power, it doesn't come from money. It comes from finally understanding your worth without needing someone else to confirm it. I waited a full week before responding. Not because I was unsure of what to say, but because I wanted every word to come from clarity, not anger. Anger demands reaction. Clarity allows intention. For 7 days, I let their messages sit unopened after the first read. I went about my routine: morning walks, coffee on the balcony, conversations with people who showed up without needing reminders. The silence didn't pressure me, it settled me. When I finally sat down to write, I didn't draft multiple versions. I didn't soften the truth. I didn't sharpen it either. I wrote once, slowly, carefully, and I sent the same email to all three of them, not individually. Not privately, together, because this wasn't about managing emotions. It was about stating reality. I didn't accuse, I didn't defend. I told them I was safe. I told them I was healthy. I told them I was happy. I told them I no longer lived in Connecticut. That alone felt like a small release, naming a truth without apology. Then I said what I had never allowed myself to say before. I told them I had spent 10 years trying to remain part of their lives. 10 years of invitations declined. Holidays spent cooking for empty rooms. Birthdays acknowledged through unanswered messages. Gifts purchased, wrapped, and eventually returned or donated because no one came to collect them. I told them how I watched my grandchildren grow up through photographs, learning their personalities through captions and comments instead of conversations. I told them I had learned to stop asking, not because I stopped caring, but because asking had started to feel like begging. Then I said the sentence that mattered most. I told them they reached out only after discovering there was money involved. I didn't frame it as accusation. I framed it as observation because it was undeniable. I told them that what hurt wasn't the distance, it was the timing of their concern. That urgency appeared only when access disappeared, and then I told them something they didn't expect. I wasn't angry. Anger still seeks engagement. I was finished waiting. I explained that if they wanted a relationship, a real one, it would have to begin from the ground up, built on consistency, on effort, on accountability, not guilt, not obligation, not inheritance. I told them money would never again be the bridge between us, that I would no longer finance silence, distance, or entitlement. I didn't threaten, I didn't bargain, I stated boundaries, clear, calm, final. I read the email twice. Not to second guess myself, but to make sure it reflected who I had become, not who I used to be. Then I pressed send, and something unexpected happened. Nothing dramatic, no rush of adrenaline, no fear, no regret, just release. It felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying, like exhaling after holding my breath for years without noticing. I closed my laptop and sat there for a moment, listening to the sounds of my life as it existed now: distant traffic, wind off the water, the quiet rhythm of a day that belonged to me. I didn't wait by my phone, I didn't check for replies. I went to dinner with friends that night, laughed, ate too much, stayed longer than planned, and when I returned home later, I realized something that would have once frightened me. Their response, whatever it might be, no longer controlled my peace. I had said what needed to be said, not to be heard, but to be done. The replies came faster than I expected, not thoughtful, not measured, immediate. It was as if my email had flipped a switch, not toward reflection, but toward defense. Lauren responded first. Her message was long, structured, and sharp. She accused me of manipulation, said I was being unfair, dramatic, that I had blindsided everyone with decisions that affected the whole family. She questioned my motives, suggested I was trying to punish them. She wrote about responsibility and unity, words that sounded impressive but felt hollow coming from someone who hadn't shown up when it mattered. Michael followed. His tone was calmer but no less dismissive. He justified everything: busy schedules, work stress, parenting. Life happens, he said, as if life hadn't been happening to me too. He implied I was exaggerating, that things weren't that bad, that everyone did their best. Jennifer's response came last, emotion heavy, carefully worded, full of feeling but short on accountability. She talked about confusion, about how the grandchildren didn't understand why grandma had disappeared, about how my choices were hurting people who did nothing wrong. Each message was different in tone, but they all shared one thing. Not a single one contained an apology. Not one said, "I'm sorry, you were right, we failed you," not even close. That absence spoke louder than anything they wrote, because people who recognize harm don't argue first. They acknowledge it, and that was the moment I understood something irreversible. They weren't interested in repairing the relationship. They were interested in restoring the old arrangement, the one where I absorbed the cost quietly and kept everything running smoothly. When that didn't work, they escalated. Gerald called a few days later. They're asking questions, he said carefully, legal ones. They had consulted lawyers, thrown around phrases like undue influence and elder financial abuse. Suggested I must have been manipulated, confused, or coerced, because in their minds the only explanation for my independence was incompetence. But facts are stubborn things. I was of sound mind. I had managed the finances for years. Every document was properly executed, every decision legally airtight. Gerald reminded them of that. Their lawyers reviewed the paperwork and then quietly backed off. No case, no leverage. No grounds, just disappointment. And just like that, the noise stopped. No more emails, no more demands, no more emotional appeals. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It didn't ache, it didn't echo. It didn't feel like abandonment, it felt like resolution. I realized something then, something that would have devastated me years earlier. Silence only hurts when you're still hoping to be chosen. I wasn't anymore. I had already chosen myself. That evening, I poured a glass of wine and sat on my balcony as the sun sank into the water. The air was warm, the harbor calm, boats drifted like they had nowhere else to be. I felt steady, grounded. Unmoved because the story had finally reached its truth. I wasn't the one who walked away. They had left long ago. I had simply stopped pretending otherwise. And once you stop pretending, peace stops being temporary. It becomes permanent. After months of emails, legal threats, and emotional pressure, everything went silent. Not gradually, not awkwardly, completely. No more messages, no more demands, no more carefully worded concern hiding frustration underneath. Just absence. One afternoon, Gerald called. His voice was calm, professional, familiar. "They've stopped trying, Florence," he said. "I think they've accepted there's nothing they can do." I thanked him, ended the call, and stepped out onto my balcony. The harbor was calm that day. Boats drifted without urgency, moving where they needed to go without explaining themselves to anyone. The sun reflected off the water in soft patterns that didn't ask to be noticed. I watched quietly. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel smug. I felt light. That surprised me, because for so long I thought closure would feel dramatic, like a moment you recognize instantly, a confrontation, an apology, a reconciliation, or even a clean break fueled by anger. This wasn't any of that. This was peace arriving without ceremony. Real justice, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't require witnesses. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't announce itself with satisfaction or revenge. Real justice is subtle. It's the moment you realize someone else's chaos no longer controls your nervous system. For years, my body had been living in quiet anticipation, braced for disappointment, trained to expect absence, conditioned to prepare explanations that would never be asked for. I had rehearsed conversations that never happened, waited for calls that never came, checked my phone for proof that I still mattered. I didn't even realize how exhausting that was until it stopped. That day, there was no waiting, no bracing. No background tension humming beneath my thoughts. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt complete. For the first time in over a decade, my mind wasn't scanning the past or negotiating the future. I wasn't wondering what I could have done differently or what I might still fix. I wasn't hoping, and that wasn't sadness, that was freedom. Hope, when it's unreciprocated long enough, becomes a form of self-neglect. I had been offering it to people who treated it like an inconvenience, something they could accept or ignore depending on their needs. Letting go of that hope didn't harden me, it softened me. Because my energy finally returned to where it belonged, me, I mattered to me, not as a role, not as a resource, not as someone useful only when convenient, as a whole person with limits, with dignity. With a life that didn't need validation to be real. I realized something standing there on the balcony, something that would have felt selfish once, but now felt obvious. Peace doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself and refusing to abandon that choice when others disapprove. I wasn't lonely, I was settled, and there's a difference. Loneliness aches, settlement steadies. Loneliness asks for more. Settlement says this is enough. The silence that followed wasn't punishment. It was acceptance, theirs and mine. They accepted there was nothing left to extract, and I accepted that I no longer needed to explain why that mattered. I went back inside, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window as evening approached. Nothing dramatic happened next, and that too felt right, because the end of a long struggle doesn't always look like a victory. Sometimes it looks like calm, and calm, I've learned, is the rarest reward of all. People assume that walking away means cutting everyone off completely. They imagine bitterness, punishment. A scorched earth ending where generosity disappears along with contact. That wasn't my story. I didn't stop being a mother. I stopped being exploited. There's an important difference, one people often miss when they've benefited from your silence for too long. For a while after everything settled, I sat with the numbers, not anxiously, not obsessively, thoughtfully. Richard and I had spent decades building what we had, and I wanted the way it was used to reflect who we were, not who others expected us to be. Money, I've learned, is never neutral. It reveals values, and I wanted mine to be clear. A large portion of Richard's estate went toward causes we believed in long before loss entered our lives. Literacy programs, because I spent 30 years watching children's futures change when they learned to love reading. Children's hospitals, because no family should carry fear alone if they don't have to. Scholarships for first-generation college students, because opportunity shouldn't depend on who your parents are. Those choices felt right, grounded, like finishing sentences Richard and I had started together. The money from the house sale went towards something even closer to my heart, a community center in a low-income neighborhood, a place for after-school programs, tutoring, meals, and safe gathering spaces, a place where people show up. Richard would have loved that, not because his name was attached, it wasn't, but because it created something living, something useful, something that didn't disappear when attention moved elsewhere. That mattered to me. But the most careful decision I made involved my grandchildren. I didn't cut them out, I protected them. I set up trust funds for each of them, accessible only when they turned 25, old enough to think independently, old enough to ask questions, old enough to decide what kind of life they want to build. The trusts are structured carefully. Their parents don't control them. They can't borrow against them. They can't pressure their children into accessing them early. The money exists as possibility, not leverage. Each trust includes a letter from me, not a dramatic letter, not an emotional one, an honest one. In it, I tell them who I am, who their grandfather was, what family meant to us, and what it requires. I explain why I stepped away, not to poison them against their parents, but to give them context. So they can decide for themselves what kind of family they want to build, so they don't inherit silence without understanding its cost. That felt like love without control, and love, if it's real, should never need control. As for the rest of the money, I spent it on living, not recklessly, not to impress anyone, intentionally, travel, experiences, learning, moments that didn't require permission or justification, meals shared with people who showed up. Days that felt full instead of drained. I stopped saving my life for people who couldn't find time for me. I stopped believing that restraint equaled virtue. There's a lie we tell women, especially mothers, that sacrifice is the highest form of love. That giving until you disappear makes you noble. It doesn't, it makes you invisible, and I had been invisible long enough. Using my resources to live fully wasn't selfish, it was honest. Because money saved for people who don't see you isn't generosity, it's postponement. I chose presence over preservation, impact over inheritance, meaning over legacy built on obligation, and the strangest part. Once I stopped worrying about how it looked, everything aligned. The money did what it was meant to do. It created stability, opportunity, joy for people who actually valued it and me. That's when I understood something simple and freeing. Walking away didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. My life is quiet now, not empty quiet. There's a difference most people don't understand until they've lived through noise that never gave anything back. My mornings begin the same way most days. Coffee on the balcony while the city wakes up slowly. The harbor stretching wide and calm, reminding me there's no rush to be anywhere else. No phone checks, no bracing for disappointment. No mental rehearsals for conversations that won't happen. Just breath, just presence. On Tuesdays, I go to book club, a small group, nothing performative. We talk about stories, but what we're really talking about is how people survive, how they change, how they choose again after loss. No one interrupts, no one rushes out early. When someone says they'll be there, they are. That still amazes me. On Thursdays, I go to painting class. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who paints. But there's something deeply healing about putting color onto canvas without needing it to mean anything. I don't explain my choices. I don't correct myself mid-stroke. I let the painting become what it wants to be. It feels like practice for living. I babysit for a neighbor when she works late. She trusts me with her grandchildren, not because I asked, but because trust grew naturally. She depends on me, checks in, says thank you. That trust means more to me than any apology ever could. I host dinners now. Real ones, tables where people arrive on time, where chairs are filled, where laughter isn't forced and silence isn't uncomfortable, where stories overlap and no one keeps score of who's done more. I cook because I enjoy it again, not because I'm hoping someone will finally show up. I don't over-prepare. I don't set extra places just in case. I don't wait. The people who come are the people who want to be there, and that's enough. I don't explain myself anymore, not why I left, not why I stayed gone, not why I chose differently. People who need explanations usually aren't looking to understand, they're looking to negotiate. I don't chase closure. Closure doesn't come from other people saying the right words. It comes from accepting that some people will never say them and choosing peace anyway. I don't measure my worth by who remembers to call. That used to control everything. My mood, my sense of value. My willingness to keep giving even when it hurt. Now, my worth is measured by how I feel in my own body when I wake up in the morning, steady, grounded, at ease. I still think about my children sometimes, not with bitterness, not with longing. With distance, the kind that allows compassion without self betrayal. I wish them well from afar, because love doesn't always look like proximity. Sometimes it looks like restraint. I've learned something important in this life I rebuilt, something I wish I'd understood sooner. You don't need everyone to choose you. You just need to stop choosing people who don't. That single decision changes everything. It changes how you spend your time, how you spend your energy, how you spend your love. Disappearing didn't make me invisible. It made me visible to myself. And that visibility, that's where life finally began again. Last month, on what would have been Richard's 80th birthday, I received one final email. The timing alone made my chest tighten. Certain dates do that, they carry memory before they carry meaning. I had already spent the morning quietly, walking along the harbor, thinking about the man Richard had been and the life we built together. I lit a candle that evening, sat with it, let the day pass without ceremony. Then the notification appeared. It was from Jennifer. I stared at the screen longer than I care to admit. For years, messages from my children had carried weight, urgency, disappointment, expectation. Even after the silence returned, the possibility of contact still stirred something old and unsettled inside me. This time was different. I almost didn't open it, because when you've been disappointed enough times, hope starts to feel reckless. Like touching a flame just to see if it still burns, but something told me to read it, slowly, without bracing, without assuming. Jennifer wrote that she'd been in therapy, not as a dramatic confession, just as a fact. She said her therapist had helped her see things she didn't want to see before, things she had avoided because they made her uncomfortable. She didn't minimize the past. She didn't blame stress or distance or misunderstanding. She named the harm clearly. She wrote that she finally understood how wrong they had been, not vaguely, not defensively, not wrapped in excuses. She said she wasn't asking for money, wasn't asking for forgiveness, wasn't asking for guarantees. That alone made me pause. She said she was asking for a chance, slowly, carefully, on my terms, not to return to what we were, but to begin something new if I was willing. And then she wrote the words I had waited 11 years to hear. I'm sorry, no explanation attached, no justification, no attempt to soften it, just ownership. I sat there for a long time with that email open in front of me, long enough for the sun to dip lower in the sky. Long enough for memory to rise and settle again. Long enough for my body to notice that I wasn't shaking. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately. Self-protection is learned behavior. You don't trust easily once disappointment becomes familiar. You don't reopen doors you had to close to survive. Another part of me wondered if this was guilt dressed up as growth. If time and loss had finally made consequences visible, and this was simply damage control arriving late. But there was another part of me too, the part that will always be a mother. That part recognized something different in her words. Something that hadn't been there before. Humility. She didn't ask me to explain myself. She didn't demand reassurance. She didn't ask to be absolved. She took responsibility and then waited. That matters. Growth doesn't always arrive on your timeline. Accountability doesn't always show up when you're still open to receiving it. Sometimes it comes late, after damage has been done, after distance has formed, after trust has eroded. Late doesn't mean fake, but late also doesn't mean automatic access. I closed my laptop and went back out onto the balcony. The harbor was quiet, evening air warm against my skin. I thought about Richard. About the kind of man he was, about the kind of father he tried to be. I thought about the years I spent waiting and the years I spent healing. I haven't replied yet, not because I don't care, but because for the first time in my life, I don't feel rushed to respond in order to be worthy of love. And that, more than the apology itself, tells me how far I've come. Here's the part people misunderstand about forgiveness. They think it's a door you open once and everything returns to how it was before. That saying, I forgive you, erases time, behavior, and consequence in one clean motion. It doesn't. Forgiveness is not access. Forgiveness is not restoration. And forgiveness is never an obligation. For most of my life, I rushed back when people showed the smallest sign of regret. I mistook words for change, apologies for repair, promises for patterns. That version of me believed love meant immediate availability, that withholding myself was cruelty, and patience meant endurance without limits. I know better now. If I respond to Jennifer, it will be slowly, carefully. Without nostalgia steering the wheel, without urgency pushing me forward. Because love without consistency isn't love, it's noise. Consistency is what was missing for over a decade, not affection, not sentiment. Not words spoken when it was convenient, presence, reliability, follow through. Those are the currencies of real relationship, and they're earned over time, not granted through apology alone. I'm not angry anymore, that's important. Anger clouds judgment, it rushes you toward reaction. It tempts you to prove something, to win something, to be seen as reasonable or kind. I don't need to be seen as anything. I'm not desperate anymore, not for connection, not for validation, not for proof that I mattered. I built a life where my worth is reflected back to me every day in friendships, routines, peace, and self-respect. I'm not lonely in that old way, the hollow way that made me accept crumbs because I was afraid of silence. I know now that loneliness isn't the absence of people, it's the absence of safety, and my life is safe. If my children want to be part of it now, they'll have to enter it the same way strangers do when they hope to earn your trust, with actions, with patience, with respect for boundaries that don't need to be defended or explained. They won't be fast-tracked because of history. History is exactly why there won't be shortcuts. If Jennifer truly understands what was broken, she'll understand why rebuilding can't be rushed, why access has to be gradual, why consistency over time matters more than emotional declarations. And if she doesn't, that answer will reveal itself without me needing to confront it. That's the gift of boundaries. They remove the need for constant vigilance. You don't have to argue, you don't have to persuade, you simply observe. I'm prepared for either outcome. That's another thing people misunderstand. Boundaries aren't built because you expect disappointment. They're built because you're no longer afraid of it. If my children choose to show up consistently, respectfully, without expectation of reward, there may be room for something new to grow, not what we had, something healthier. And if they don't, I will still be okay, not bravely okay, not pretending to be okay, genuinely okay. That's the part I worked hardest for, the peace that doesn't hinge on someone else's behavior, the stability that isn't threatened by silence, the self-trust that says I will protect what I've built, even if it costs me relationships that were never safe. Forgiveness may come, access will be earned, and this time I won't confuse the two. I'm 72 years old now. That number still surprises me when I say it out loud, not because I feel young, but because I finally feel present. So much of my life was spent anticipating, waiting, explaining, adjusting. I didn't realize how much of myself I postponed until I stopped doing it. At this age, you stop romanticizing struggle. You stop believing endurance is the same as virtue. You start telling the truth, gently but without apology. Here's what I know for certain. Kindness is not weakness. It never was. Kindness becomes weakness only when it's offered without boundaries, when it's drained from you by people who mistake generosity for obligation. Real kindness includes discernment. It includes self-respect. Silence is not acceptance. Silence can be grief. Silence can be self-preservation. Silence can be the sound of someone choosing not to fight a battle that only hurts them. And love, real love, does not require self-abandonment. That line nearly erased me. I gave people everything I had to give: time, money, patience, grace, and still I became an afterthought. When that happens, walking away isn't cruelty. It's clarity. I didn't disappear to punish my children. I disappeared because staying meant losing myself piece by piece until there was nothing left but usefulness. I reclaimed my life, my money, my time, my peace. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. Whether my children ever truly earn their way back into my world or not, I've made peace with the uncertainty. That's not resignation, that's strength. Because I no longer build my future around someone else's potential remorse. I build it around who I am now. I wake up without dread. I live without bargaining. I love without erasing myself. And that, after everything, feels like the greatest victory of all. If there's one lesson I would leave you with, it's this: you can love deeply and still walk away. You can forgive and still protect yourself. You can be generous and still say no more. Leaving doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means you finally listened to yourself. I didn't stop begging to be loved because I hardened. I stopped because I learned something better. I learned how to love myself without conditions. My name is Florence. I'm 72 years old, and for the first time in over a decade, I'm not surviving anymore. I'm living.